Hello, everyone. I'm Jarrett Martin, for those of you who don't know me. And I did the book report for a really difficult book called Sickness Unto Death by Søren Kierkegaard. I was a little frustrated when I very first got my hands on it, just because it's really difficult reading. But Søren had some really great stuff to say about life and kind of became the father of his certain philosophical school. So I'll just start by kind of telling you a little bit about him, then telling you more about the book down the line. So Søren Kierkegaard was born May 5th, 1813 in Copenhagen. He was the seventh child of a deeply depressed, wealthy, and religious man. Søren's father, Michael Kierkegaard, proved to be a really shrewd businessman with sharp intellect. So subsequently, when he was able to retire early and pursued theology and philosophy. So when Søren's father died, his dad gave him his fortune, um, a lot of his intellectual passion, but also some of his same shortcomings. So Søren, being very religious like his dad, was well on his way to becoming a pastor in the Danish church. However, his desire to be a writer proved too strong. Although he came from a school in Copenhagen, which is the School of Civic Virtue, which wrote primarily in Latin, he decided to publish many of his works in Danish. His choice to publish in Danish would eventually kind of explain why his work took so long to influence the world of philosophy. When he wrote in his day and age, a lot of the things that he wrote didn't quite have the same international impact and significance as it does today. So, as he finished school, Kierkegaard increasingly desired that he became a part of the literary set in Copenhagen, which just kind of means like the group of authors and the group of professors who would write things in Copenhagen. So he held in really high esteem Professor J.L. Heiberg, who was known as a playwright, philosopher, um, journal publisher, and kind of the head of Copenhagen's literati, which is just again the famous group of writers and people who work with literature in Copenhagen. So eventually, Kierkegaard was able to gain some of the recognition of this guy Heiberg that he really admired. That was because he wrote some really well received satirical pieces and some literary criticism that caught Heiberg's eyes. However, Kierkegaard's relationship with Heiberg kind of soured when Heiberg criticized Kierkegaard's first work, which was called Either or, in a really snazzy and kind of like hipster way. So, following that time, Kierkegaard's relationship with the Copenhagen literary set was kind of strained. This strain was highlighted by many satirical writings, which Kierkegaard used to ultimately criticize Heiberg. So there was kind of this ongoing dispute and beef between all of these writers, and Kierkegaard would make satirical pieces about Heiberg and vice versa. So it's actually believed that in his lifetime, Kierkegaard was not actually taken seriously by his Danish counterparts. In fact, towards the end of his life, a Copenhagen newspaper published a series of satirical cartoons about Kierkegaard that pretty much reduced him to the local laughing stock. So obviously, that's not how anyone wants to be remembered in their time by their peers. But I think even some of the pain that may have been caused by being the local laughing stock really influenced Kierkegaard's writing down the line. So in the 19th century, he kind of had this posthumous revival of people really reconsidering his work and looking at it as again. He's often considered to be the father of existentialism, and his work has had a vast influence on 19th century Christian theology as well. One of his most significant works was called Sickness Unto Death, which is probably his most clear and concise work on religion. And those words, clear and concise, are really funny when you pair that with this work, and you'll see why. But this work was really written under a name, and that name was Anti-Climatius. So he was writing as this author, Anti-Climatius, and it was kind of in response to the antithesis of Johannes Climatius. Climatius derives his name from a monk who wrote a book called Scala Paradisi, which embraced the idea that it's possible for human beings to ascend to heaven under his own power. So he wrote this book, again, under the name Anti-Climacus, in response to kind of on the other end of the spectrum from this writer whose name is Climacus, who is saying that you can reach heaven under your own power. So in Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard uses this idea of the self and despair to explain his Christian point of view, which is really contrary to what was written in this previous book, which had more of a asceticism philosophy throughout. So Kierkegaard goes about doing this in a really interesting way, which many find is very confusing and convoluted, including myself. Some experts even argue that Kierkegaard is not trying to write in a strict and factual and logical manner as we've come to expect in a lot of writings, but instead he's trying to write in a way that forces the reader to contemplate and grapple with what they are reading. So whether he's right or wrong, his thought process is kind of like, if I can make this really confusing, they're going to have to really try to figure out what I'm actually talking about. And as a result, they're going to have to think a little bit more deeply about what I'm saying. So he began the whole book by unpacking the statement that despair is sickness unto death. And to Kierkegaard, despair is just like sin, and it's completely universal. Even those who claim to have no despair are in fact in despair, and they just don't know it yet. So Kierkegaard believes that humans are made up of various elements. Those two elements are kind of possibility and necessity, the finite, which is our body, and then there's also the infinite. So these elements will at times get out of balance, and despair is the result. So Kierkegaard goes on in the book to diagnose exactly what's happening when possibility and necessity and when the finite and infinite are out of balance. So he'll go on and say, when the finite is really high, but the infinite is really low, then might be what one is feeling. So I will spare you that, but he follows that section up by outlining from least severe to most severe the self-consciousness that's associated with despair. He starts by detailing that despair does not know that is despair. All pagans are in this category. So again, there's a special category of people who are in despair but do not know that they are in despair. They might be defensive when they're told in despair. However, it may be easier for them to overcome their despair than for others who are already more conscious. Following that, Kierkegaard explains that there's another type of despair, which is also despair and weakness. This is when someone doesn't want to be themselves. These type of people fall into two different categories. First, there are people who are in despair because they're discontent with where they are in life, and their despair springs from taking a more earthly approach to life. But then secondly, there are people who are in a despair over the spiritual or the eternal. These people see their despair as a spiritual issue but remains focused on their own weakness. This despair is much more volatile than his or her earthly counterpart. Kierkegaard finishes by adding that there is a despair of defiance, or the despair of wanting to be oneself, which is kind of, as he sees it, a defiance towards God. This person wants complete control over their own life, and is possibly, in Kierkegaard's eyes, influenced by demons. So Kierkegaard goes on to more specifically define sin, all sin, as despair before God. This maintains that sin is a position and not an action. Faith, not morality, is the only thing that can set us free from our sins. Thus, faith in God has the ability to make someone who they really are, so that the imbalance between despair no longer has a place in their lives. Once this sin is identified, it can be intensified in someone's life if they do not put their hope in Jesus Christ. Again, Kierkegaard explains this concept from least to greatest. These three levels are best summed up as the sin of despairing over one's sin, the sin of despairing over the forgiveness of sin, and the sin of dismissing Christianity. Kierkegaard finishes his work by summing up that despair is indeed sin, the opposite of sin is faith, and that faith is establishing relationship with God. So in Kierkegaard's eyes, we have this, every human has this huge amount of despair and this huge separation between who they are and who they want to be. And that separation itself is man's sinful nature, which is this position that is kind of set against God. But once we come into relationship with God, the gap between who we want to be and who we are is basically healed. So we no longer have to live with this despair in our lives anymore. So my critical response, I said that Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death is an important work that's influenced many modern thinkers. That's pretty self-evident. But Kierkegaard is seen as many as the founder of existentialism. And existentialism is defined as a philosophical theory or approach that emphasizes the existence of an individual person as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of will. So Sickness Unto Death certainly interacts with the ideas of the existence of humanity and what makes humans humans. Kierkegaard believes that faith closes or at least helps people cope with a gap between who they are and who they want to be. Kierkegaard may say that faith helps to make people completely human, but he doesn't recognize that the presence of despair in and of itself is kind of a uniquely human attribute. So yes, while faith does help make us human, the presence of despair also is a signal that we're human to begin with. Also, Kierkegaard calls the gap between who we are and who we want to be despair. Because of his difficult background and upbringing, Kierkegaard may have unknowingly put a more pessimistic take on this separation between who we are and who we want to be than others in his field may. What if Kierkegaard calls despair other things, like hope, potential, or a healthy tension? Kierkegaard's work is a blanket statement that only confronts the ignorance of despair and not alternative interpretations. Additionally, Kierkegaard uses a hierarchy to explain sin and despair from least to worst, yet he does not use an objective measure to justify those statements. Instead, he resorts to well thought out personal opinions to make his claim. So, for example, when he says, "This is the worst type of despair you can ever have," how does he actually able to back that up as being the worst? Kierkegaard's writing style is also convoluted and tends to lend itself to the abstract. So he goes to great lengths to explain why one must put their faith in Christ to remedy their sin of despair. But since and as an abstract idea, this makes a pretty good amount of sense. However, he never explains what happens to the very practical source of one's despair. For example, if one has the despair of not having the job they want, yet they get saved, they may still experience that despair of not being exactly where they want. Is that despair still sin? Another interesting thing about his writing and the convoluted style that he does it in is that many people think that the style that he's written it in is actually to mock the people around him and the other convoluted um, philosophers of his time that use hierarchies and definitions um, to extremes. While that may be true, it makes for a difficult read and a difficult understanding of his work. To sum it all up, though, Kierkegaard does a great job presenting Jesus Christ to a secular world. His writing style and content organization delayed his influence on philosophical and theological schools of thought, but with time, Kierkegaard has been able to rise in prominence as an exceptional thinker. Sickness and Death may leave a reader with more questions than with concrete answers, something that I feel like Kierkegaard likely embraced. Kierkegaard in Sickness and Death is a great work that many will probably grapple with for years to come. This affected my life, and I'm sure the lives of others. Thank you.